Do you think more people are joining the alt-right spaces and adopting those kind of ideologies in the past? And if so, why?
Well, I think that the alt-right used to be a larger deal than it is now, but the terms have shifted a little bit. See, a couple of years ago, the arguments that alt-righters concern themselves with regards to racial inequality, gender, so on and so forth, those are more mainstream now than they used to be. I would say that the alt-right has become, in a way, redundant. Mainstream Republican politicians have gotten better at appealing to these interests while maintaining at least a large portion of their constituency. So I think that the alt-right is kind of like a precursor force or like a predicating force to what we see now. The arguments have remained more or less the same.
Yeah. So okay, my next proper question is who are like most in danger from the rising prominence? Or I guess, lowering prominence as it's not as big as it was.
Well, the ideology is still like very, very present right now. I just think it's being folded in and incorporated into the mainstream Republican talking points. Funny story on that. You've probably heard of a guy called Nick Fuentes, one of the premiers of.
Oh God,
I see. Yes, you do.
that
Okay,
bastard.
so here's something funny. Nick Fuentes, he's a funny guy. He's a wacky dude. He's definitely repressing something. He had a big fallout with his core circle some time ago, maybe a year ago, because it's something to do with him, like something with couches and UV lights. I don't remember the details, but there was a former confidant of his who was talking dismissively of Nick, who was saying that Nick has been acting out lately, doing things that are stupider, less optically viable, like more open Hitler promotion, that kind of stuff. And the reason for that is because Nick Fuentes fundamentally is just in it for the money, as is the case with a lot of online far right personalities. And what Nick Fuentes realized is that there's not really that much of a difference ideologically between him and somebody like Charlie Kirk, a person who shared the stage with Donald Trump before in a way that Nick never will. That's just because Charlie Kirk, I mean, he talks about the same stuff. He talks about, the white population of the United States being overwhelmed by non-white people. He talks about the Hart-Celler Act, or whatever the Immigration Act 64 is. He talks about a nebulous group of media intellectuals who conspire to promote liberalism and anti-white degeneracy. He talks about all the Nazi points. He just doesn't say the key words because, of course, that'll get you knocked off the air. So the
Yeah.
frustration then with Nick is, well, how do I distinguish myself? Okay, you've got Nazis in the mainstream, and then you've got Nazis like me, whose main distinguishing characteristic, I guess, is that, I can say the N-word without getting in trouble. But that means they've been folded in, right? The optically viable ones, at least. And it seems like every day now, TPUSA has some white nationalist outed in their ranks, some open neo-Nazi. I think one of the staffers for Paul Gosar, the congressman, he was found to be a Nick Fuentes fan just 3 or 4 days ago.
Really?
Mhm.
I didn't hear that.
Yeah, well, it's not the first time it's happened with Gosar. Gosar has literally done stuff with Nick Fuentes before, so it's pretty, all I'm saying is that this is a broad issue. But the people most at risk from this are transgender people, because since there is an integration between the alt-right talking points and the GOP, and the trans people are the current target of their machinations. They're the icon of degeneracy that the far right is currently obsessed with sexually fantasizing about slash destroying, as is so often the case. Women get a lot of backlash here too. Can't imagine this is an easy world to
Yeah.
be growing up as a young girl, seeing all of this anti-woman stuff come back.
I see a lot of alt-right ideologies focusing on some kind of the idea of like freeing themselves from like some kind of amorphous, superficial thing, like the woke mob or transgenderism is out to get them. Like it's like a boogeyman of sorts, but like out to get them. And it's kind of like saving yourself and saving others from this superstitial thing. Is that just me, or do you get where I'm coming from?
Yeah, well, it's much easier to demonize a group when you conflate the existence of the group with an ideology. This is, I mean, historically, this is one of the like tried and true tactics of actual Nazis who conflated Jewish people with Judeo-Bolshevism, which was their conspiracy theory, which is functionally the same. In fact, it is the same as the modern day cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. It's the same thing. This is the reason why the far right doesn't talk about trans people. Go look at their posts. They don't say trans people, like ever. They never say trans people because that would include the word people. which they want to avoid. Instead, it's transgenderism, transgender ideology, the transgender mob. It's a component of dehumanization. There's nothing wrong with referring to people in groups, obviously. We have to simplify things for, you know, convenience's sake when talking about big issues. But this goes beyond that. To give an example, I would say, while people certainly use terms like the alt-right, to refer broadly to a group, I don't think I've ever seen the left outright refuse to use humanistic terms when referring to them. To say, oh, this person joined the alt-right, or this member of the alt-right, as opposed to this like oblique, generalizing ideological conflation.
Yeah. Okay. So would you say that there have been previous versions of the alt-right in like previous times in like the 90s, the 80s, which are a bit more, I mean, in like the real world instead of on the internet?
Oh yeah, for sure. The closest parallel that I can think of in recent history would probably be the Satanic Panic, which you'll see plenty of in the modern day like far-right movement. That's a pretty clear-cut one, I would say. The farther back you go, I mean, obviously during the 1960s civil rights movement, there were myriad radicalized ultra-far-right groups with regards to race and gender politics, because the second wave feminist movement was prominent during that time. It's really a matter of like, what is the... It's an ultra-reactionary backlash. People are fearful. People are, well, stupid. They get upset, and they suddenly take it upon themselves to become arbiters of great Western civilization, to defend it all against something or other, usually people who aren't white. And it molds itself to the era of the time. It goes back further than even the Nazis, right? Like, we think of the alt-right as Nazis, and for the most part they are, or at least they're very adjacent and ideologically similar. But it goes back before the Nazis. The treatment of Hispanic people during the turn of the century, the attitudes that people had towards anarchists and socialist leaders back during the workers' strikes and the turn of a century. If you go back to the 1800s, as black people moved north from the South after the Civil War, there were localized hate groups that talked about how the cities were being bowled over and overrun with, oh, they used unkind words for the black people, but you know what I mean. It goes back on and on. It's fundamental reactionary tendencies. And while fascism is a more modern iteration, because fascism is a modern ideology, the things that underlie it go back a really long time. I mean, a really long time. I mean, back in Europe, there were kings whose primary act as a monarch, the main thing they did was expelling Jews from their country. I mean, think of all the pogroms and all the hatred and misery and rhetoric that must have led up to that point. Didn't just happen out of nowhere. So we're dealing with like a fundamental disease, but not an innate or unchanging one. Things have changed and also have gotten better. On average, people are less reactionary than they used to be. So I say we just keep that trend going.